Hi everyone and welcome. I am Chaitanya. You're watching Chai with Chaitanya. This is a place where I talk about books, movies and fandom. And today I'm talking about An Enchantment of Ravens by Marget Rogerson. And I want to know that where exactly was this book? Why had I not heard of it before? And is it better than the ACOTAR series by Sarah J. Maas? So if you're like me who's wondering about the last question, then do go ahead and give this video a watch. This is a non-spoilery review, so you will not be spoiled, and let's go and dive right into it. First things first, because I happen to enjoy this book so much, I will not be going ahead and giving you a very descriptive synopsis for this book, because I really want you to go ahead and pick this up with knowing just as little as possible and just knowing the basic plot line. So we basically follow Isobel, who is a human like us, and her craft is that she is a painter. She paints really well, and her clients are fae people. Unlike the world of Sarah J. Maas or Holly Black, Cassandra Clare, fays in this world cannot really create craft, so they depend on all forms of craft onto the humans who produce it for them, and they buy it from them, or they provide some sort of service in return to. So one day what happens is that she gets a client who is the Autumn Prince, Rook, and he has not been seen coming to the human lands for centuries, and he just turns up at her doorstep to get a portrait done, and she somehow makes this portrait for him, but she puts something in this portrait which Rook did not wanted in the first place, because he did not know that Isobel would be able to find that sort of thing in him. And when he takes this painting and reveals it in front of his entire court, the entire court comes to see this, and they are obviously taken aback, and they no longer feel very safe with Rook as their prince. And because of this, Rook comes back to Isobel, and she has to go with him, because now she's going to stand on the trial for the crime that she has committed, and that is to paint something in Rook's painting which Rook did not wanted, and which Rook did not wanted other people, other fays to see. And we just sort of go from there. Like other fantasy books that you might have read, this book is a standalone, and it packs the entire story in 300 pages, and it's a very short and a very breezy read. I read it in 2 days, and the fact that I could not put this book down, I loved the writing, I loved the world building, I loved the characters, I loved every single thing about this book. So I'm now going to go ahead and talk a little about each of these things in detail. Now first up, I want to talk about the writing and the world building, and let's just take a moment to appreciate Marget Rogerson for the world that she has created. I was amazed, I was shook that she can create a world as expansive and as atmospheric and as lyrical, as rich as this in just 300 pages. I think that all fantasy authors out there needs to go and pick this book up and just read it, to understand that how you do not need pages after pages and books after books to create a world. You can do that in less than 20 pages, which is what Marget Rogerson does in this book. And I couldn't keep a finger on anything and say that this is something that I do not understand, or this is confusing to me, or this is something which is weird, because every single thing about this book was beautiful. The world that she's created is so whimsical. A lot of the story takes place in the forest, and it's the same setting, same location. They are going on and on in circles, or they are coming back and again going back into the forest, and there is a lot of forest imagery, a lot of nature related imagery, which is crazy, because when I was reading, I just felt that I am right there into the book. So now coming to the last aspect of the world building, which I really enjoyed, and this is arguably the best part of this book, which is to do with the ways these fae people exist. And unlike what we are normally used to, like we see that fae people are tall, broad, and they are beautiful, they have weird color eyes which appeal to everyone, and these people are broken, and all that they need in the world is a little bit of love, a little bit of understanding, and their PTSD will get cured, and they will just go on from there to have a happily ever after. But in this book, and this is not a spoiler, there is something inherently wrong with these people, and they are not the kind of fays that you have known so far. And that was such an interesting thing to read, because I have read so many fae books by now, and almost all of the fae books are very similar to the kind of fays that I spoke about in general, what we know so far. And this was a refreshing change. In fact, it was a very interesting change to see, and I absolutely enjoyed that aspect of the book way more than I actually thought I would. And in a way, I actually preferred this kind of fae way more over than the other kind of fae, which is the normal, the bold, beautiful and broken, and they just need love to to get cured, and we just go from there. Going ahead and talking about the characters. So first up I have Isobel, because I love Isobel's character. Not that I do not love Rook's character, but I love Isobel's character way more than I love Rook's character, because Isobel as a fantasy protagonist is so relatable, and that is something that I have never felt with other fantasy protagonists, because of the fact that usually you would see in a fantasy that the protagonist is from the human world, and he or she is plucked from the human world and then thrown into the fantasy world, and they have to just make sense of the whole world. And while that also sort of happens in here, but what you get to see in this book is the fact that Isobel is already aware of the fantasy world. She's already aware of the people that are there in the fantasy world. She's already aware of everything that one needs to know at the at the very basic level. And yet she goes into the fantasy world, and she has this moral compass 24/7, where she knows who she truly is and what she wants. So she always makes her own decision, and she is the master of who she is. And at no point do you feel this tension, or do you feel this question as to she's not sure of who she is. She's always sure of that. What she's not sure of is the decisions that she's making for herself. And all these decisions that she makes for herself is made from a point where it's only her who makes it and nobody else. And even though there are so many things that go around her, you still get to see that how she trusts herself, how she goes out there and is always strong, is always fierce and always independent, and just wins the world by being who she is. And I think that is the great aspect of this book. And talking about Rook, who is the Prince of the Autumn Court, I think that Rook's character is very interesting in a way that he is somebody who's very reserved, he's very shy, he's very innocent, and yet at the same time he has to be somebody who he's not, because in the Fae world that these guys have, they are completely ruled by power and strength. And in order for him to maintain that strength, he always has to have that sort of a position of authority, which probably by default he doesn't really wants to have. And that is also one of his major conflicts, which I could spot. And when he meets Isobel, he sort of understands this emotion way more better, because Isobel by default starts seeing Rook from her own eyes, which is eyes of the human. And because Rook has lived for centuries and centuries, he for the first time in a very long while gets to have and gets to share his emotions in a way in which he otherwise is not very sure of, and he has never probably has experienced that sort of thing. Talking about the romance that is there in this book, so I could spot that there are two tropes. One is insta love trope, and the second is enemies to lovers trope. So the insta love trope is very short and very quick, and you can say that it's just there as a catalyst to bring on the enemies to lovers trope, which makes sense, because otherwise this book is really short, so you have to give the characters enough time to actually develop that sort of feelings towards one another, and surprisingly enough the author has managed to do that. So the enemies to lovers trope is handled really well in regards to the fact that the last book that I read before this was Shelby Morin's Serpent and Dove, and unlike that book, in here the romance is done well in the way that they have got these moments where both of these people know that there is something that they feel about one another. And even though you're following Isobel at all times, because this book is in the first person, you only get to see Isobel's perspective, and yet even through Isobel's perspective it's quite clear that even Rook feels something for Isobel, but he's not ready to accept it. And at the same time, Isobel, who sort of knows what she feels, is also not ready to accept it for the consequences that she knows she will have to face, and she's not sure of the choices that she's making, and until unless she's not sure of the choices that she's making, she will not make them. Now, I would not go ahead and call the romance that these guys share angsty, because I personally felt that the romance was very innocent, and it was handled in a way where you get to see the transition from enemies to lovers. In fact, from enemies you get to see how they come to a ploying field, like a neutral field where they can be friends, and how they stay friends, or they have this dynamic where they both respect each other for who they are, and they have a mutual liking towards one another. And then you get to see that how they go from there, and they become lovers. And I felt that that is something which is the highlight of this book, because again, the romance is the central part of the story. It is the crux of this story, so it is very important, and I felt that the romance in here is done really well. In fact, right now this is one of my favorite books, so this is definitely one of my favorite romances, and I would definitely recommend it to you if you're somebody who likes reading books with romance fantasy books with romance as its crux, then this book is definitely a must for you. Going ahead and talking about all the things that I really enjoyed in this book in no particular order. And the first is that I really felt that the author knew that where she is going in the story at all points of time. Like, there were lots of problematic elements that were there in the book, lots of problematic conflicts that were brought into the book, and each of these problematic conflicts were resolved in a way where you felt that yes, this makes sense, and nothing felt that it's just forced into it, and nothing felt as if it's there because for the sake of being there. And again, as I said, this is a very short read, so it was just very surprising to see that how is the author able to put in and pack in so much of stuff in such a short book. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the fact that it was really dark, and I'm not personally a fan of dark books in fantasy, because it usually scares me, and again, I do not read paranormal fantasy in general. But this again did not have that paranormal aspect, but it had a lot of weird creatures and forest elements, and that whole atmospheric feeling which was brought because of the enchanted forest that we were in for most part of this book. As I already mentioned, you get to see that the world is very grim, and the surprising element in this dark and grim world was the fact that there was a lot of humor to it. And the humor was done in a way wherein it did not feel forced. In fact, it felt very real, it felt very effortless, and that was an interesting aspect to see and read in a book like this, because I haven't come across fantasy books wherein humor is used in this way, and I really enjoyed myself with that. Next thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the fact that it was really suspenseful and very thrilling as an adventure to follow. Now, both thrill and suspense as an element was brought in because of the fact that the antagonist in this book was not very clear from the very beginning as to who it is, and there were a lot of possibilities as to who the antagonist can be. And each time when you try to think or predict that this is the antagonist, you will be convinced that he is the antagonist, and boom, Marget Rogerson would come in and she would take the story in another way altogether. And that is exactly what kept me entertained, because every single time I felt I knew where the story is going, it actually sidestepped and then it went in a different direction. There is no overuse of any sort of trope, even though there is insta trope and there are other sort of tropes which you can also find in the book, because I felt that this book is suddenly going towards this trope, or this is the general theme that it's going to go and follow, but somehow in some way that did not really happen. Next, I think that the way art is used in this book is also very interesting, and it's very empowering as a thing to read, as an element to read, because how many books have you read where art has been given this kind of preference? Obviously, I cannot go in details and tell you how exactly is the art very empowering, but once you read the book, you will actually be able to understand what I'm trying to say. And I genuinely enjoyed reading the way art was such a great part of the story, and until the end I did not actually see that part of the story coming in picture at the same time. But when it did, it just all came together like a big jigsaw puzzle, and I was actually surprised and quite taken aback the way in which the whole story came together. Now, coming to the last aspect which I really enjoyed in this book, which was the court politics, and there was a lot of court politics, surprisingly, even in this short read. There aren't 7 courts, there aren't too many courts, there are just 4 courts, and even though you do not really go to each of these courts, yet each of these courts have been established in a way where you get to see why they're important and what their function is. And each of these 4 courts come into picture and they sort of interact, and there are lies, manipulation, and how fairy politics are. There is a lot of drama, and I felt myself completely guessing and trying to understand what is happening, but I kept failing, and I kept enjoying the process of me trying to guess and fail at each time, and obviously with the drama that was being brought out. Also, finally, An Enchantment of Ravens, the name in itself is very beautiful, and this would be a spoiler thing, which is why I cannot say, but there is one thing that really bothered me about this book, and this is probably the only criticism, but it's not exactly a criticism. It is the fact that there is something about Isabel which you feel that you will get to know by the end of the book or somewhere in the book, but you just do not get to know about that, and it kept bothering me that why do we not get to know it. But as my best friend Bookish Bell 1008 Vaishnavi, who read this book after I recommended it to her so much, and she read it in one day, almost like in 2 sittings, and she loved it so much that she is now also talking about this book on her Bookstagram, so you guys can go and check that out in the description box below. She said that it's something that was personal for Rook and Isabel, and we as readers do not get to know what it was. And I think that's a beautiful thing to have. Finally, my final verdict of this book is that I gave it a 5 on 5 stars. There is no way on earth that I could have given this book anything less than a 5 stars, because I enjoyed every single thing about this book. I don't know why that this book has got such polarizing views, and probably it is because a lot of things about this book is very similar to A Coat of Thorns and Roses, which is why I, in the beginning of the video, also asked if this book is better than that. And in all my opinion, in my personal opinion, yes, this is. You can choose to feel differently about this book, or you can have a different opinion, which I would respect. But in my opinion, this book is 10 times way more better than A Coat of Thorns and Roses series, or if not, at least the first book. And even though I do enjoy A Coat of Thorns and Roses for its very own reasons, but yet if there was a choice that I had to pick one book, I would definitely go ahead and pick this book up. Finally, I would like to say that there is a special place in my heart for authors who are able to write fantasy and just write fantasy in one book. As I said, this is a standalone, and being the person that I am, I'm not very comfortable with committing myself to series, because it just makes me want to finish the series, and usually my TBR is so long that I can never get across to finishing them at a stretch. If you have read this and if you like this book, then do let me know. I know for a fact that this is a very polarizing read otherwise, so I would definitely want to know what your opinion is. And if you have not read this book, then I would definitely recommend you this book very strongly. And I loved it so much that I'm going to reread this super soon. And that brings us to the end of this video. Until next time, keep reading and bye.